This study is a little bit different from the ones we've done so far in the series because they were about basic principles of the gospel. This study is about a person, but he's a person who illustrates the basic principles of the gospel in a very real way. Abraham received promises. Those promises are relevant now. They're relevant to us because those promises can be extended to us. Anyway, let's begin by thinking who Abraham was. First of all, Abraham lived a very long time ago. He lived 4,000 years ago, give or take a few years. So if you think about this time chart, that's today, just after 2000 AD. Jesus was born about 2,000 years ago, give or take a bit. And Abraham was as far before Jesus as we are after Jesus. So when we talk about Jesus now, we're talking about someone who lived as long before us as Abraham lived before Jesus. But even so, Abraham is a very important person. Abraham came from, probably was born in, a city in southern Iraq, Mesopotamia, called Ur, sometimes known as Ur of the Chaldees. It was a city of great civilization. It had multi-story buildings. It had running water. It had mains drainage. But Abraham left it and he went to another city called Haran in the north of Mesopotamia. And sometime before he reached Haran, possibly while he was in Ur itself, but sometime in Mesopotamia, Abraham had a message from God. And the message said, here are some promises. You can receive these promises if you do what I tell you to do. And Abraham had to carry on. He had to go to a land he didn't know. It was the land of Canaan. Canaan is down here. It's now Israel and Palestine. And Abraham believed God and he followed what God told him. He went down to the land of Canaan and God said, I'll give you promises. And then he, for the rest of his life, stayed more or less in the land of Canaan, and he wandered around. He lived in tents. He went from one place to another. At one point, he got as far as Egypt. He certainly got to the north end of the land of Canaan, and the rest of his life he was a wandering person, a nomad. The promise that Abraham was given, here we are, the first of them, or the first set, come in Genesis chapter 12. And it starts off to leave not only his country, but also his family, even his close nuclear family, and he was going to carry on to the land. He was going to be shown the land of Canaan. And the first of the promises, he was going to become a great nation. He was going to have descendants who would grow up in number until they became a huge number of them, a great nation. Now, Abraham was an old man. He was too old to be having children. His wife was an old lady, 10 years younger than him, but even so, she was too old to have children. But the promise is there. He's going to become a great nation. Second promise, he's going to have a great name. Well, the first one's fulfilled. The nation of Israel are descendants of Abraham. So are the Arab nations, for that matter. The name, an important name, a great name. Well, here we are talking about Abraham. I don't know how many other people from 2000 BC we even know the name of. Certainly we don't talk about them very much. So Abraham has a great name as well. And the third thing was that in him, and I think he's talking about his descendants here, but it is in Abraham as well, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. So it's a great blessing to come to us through Abraham. So that's the first set of promises that Abraham receives, and he receives them as he sets off for Canaan. Next chapter contains some more promises. He's now arrived in the land. He gets to the land of Canaan with some few of his family, particularly his nephew Lot. But Lot and his retinue have gone away, and they've gone down to live in the Jordan Valley. And finally, Abraham is on his own. He's fulfilled the conditions that God has given him. And God says to Abraham, look at the land around you. He says, you can go north and south and east and west. You can walk up and down the land of Canaan, and all that land he will give. He says, I will give it to you. So first of all, that land is promised to Abraham himself. And it's also promised to Abraham's descendants. He's going to have many descendants. They're going to be as many as the dust of the earth, he says. So there are going to be very many of these descendants. But he emphasizes it's a promise to Abraham himself. I will give the land to you, Abraham. So again, we've got these promises, the land, descendants, and that these descendants will be very much in number. And this is the further promise that goes on to Abraham. Now, Abraham was getting to be an old man. Well, he was already an old man when he set off from Haran. He's even older now. He changed the name of Abraham's wife, and God promises that she is going to have children. Abraham laughs at that. It says he fell on his face and he laughed and said, I'm 100 years old. Am I going to have a child? What about Sarah? She's 90. She's going to have a child. God says, yes, going to have a child. God said, no, Sarah, your wife, will give you a son. You'll call him Isaac. Why Isaac? Well, in Hebrew, Yitzhak means he laughs, but it's in a tense that means he keeps on laughing. And continually, there's going to be a laugh through Isaac. Everyone's going to be made happy because of this. But Sarah is going to have a child. It's Isaac, and Isaac is going to grow up and is going to produce descendants who in the end will grow to be a great nation, and a growing number, that is, to be a great nation. Well, time goes on. Abraham has already taken Sarah's, it says handmaid, which is really a slave girl, and they've had a descendant called Ishmael. Ishmael isn't the son of promise, though, and Ishmael is sent away along with Hagar, his mother, the servant of Sarah. And Isaac grows up and becomes a promising young man. And when he's about 20 years old, God tells Abraham to sacrifice him. And they go to a place called Moriah. It's a hill. At that point, it's just outside Jerusalem. Now it's inside Jerusalem. Solomon extended the size of Jerusalem, and he built a temple on Mount Moriah, and that's now the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. That's where it is, but at the moment, it's just a hill. And up to the top of it goes Abraham, and they build an altar, and Abraham ties up Isaac and puts him on the altar, and is going to sacrifice him. That means he's going to kill him. Now, Abraham, it seems, must have trusted God, because Abraham knew that Isaac was the promised descendant who was going to produce a great nation. He's not married yet. He's not got any children. If God allows him to die, then the promise isn't going to work. And Isaac must have either had further information or trusted the information he already got. He trusted what God said, and he trusted his father, and he allows himself to be bound and tied in altar. Remember, Isaac's about 20, Abraham's about 120. Isaac could easily have got away from Abraham if he wanted, but he allowed himself to be a willing sacrifice, and he is tied to the altar, and Abraham raises the knife to kill him, and an angel calls from heaven and says, stop. And Isaac is released, and he comes back more or less from the dead. Now, can you think of another instance where a father allows his son to be a sacrifice and receives him back from the dead? It's an obvious one. God allows Jesus to be killed as a sacrifice, but he raises him up from the dead on the third day. And what we have here is an echo of the sacrifice and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which happens much later on. Anyway, as a result of his faith, or of the near sacrifice of Isaac, what's known as the binding of Isaac, Abraham is given further promise. And here we have the final promise, or the final set of promises. And God swears by himself. He can swear by nothing greater. So he swears by himself and says, because you have allowed your only son, you haven't to be sacrificed, you haven't held him back, he's going to bless you, and he's going to have many descendants, as many as the grains of sand on the seashore, or as the stars of heaven, it says. But there he's talking about many descendants, and suddenly it changes, because here we have one descendant, the gate of his enemies. So we're going to have one descendant, and that descendant is going to be victorious. He's going to defeat his enemies. And that offspring is going to bring the blessing to all nations. Well, we've already seen who that is. We're talking about Jesus, because Jesus is a descendant of Abraham. So we've got these promises made to Abraham because of Abraham's faith, but one of the promises is there'll be a descendant of Abraham who will be victorious and will bring the blessing to all the nations, and, well, that's Jesus. So you can see how the family tree of Abraham develops. So we start off with Abraham married to Sarah. First of all, he has this son Ishmael, but Ishmael is not the son of promise, and he goes away, where he becomes an important forefather of the Arab nations. Sarah and Abraham then have a child, that's Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah, and they have two children, Esau and Jacob. Esau doesn't think much of his birthright, and he sells it, his inheritance, he sells it to Jacob for a plate of stew. And Jacob is the new descendant with the promise, and God changes his name. He's renamed Israel. Well, Jacob has 12 sons and at least one daughter, and these become important people. They are the forefathers of the 12 divisions of the nation of Israel. And they grow up and become a nation. There are 12 tribes within that nation, and each of these is named after the forefather, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. So there we've got the 12 tribes of Israel. And preeminent among them is the tribe of Judah. And a descendant of Judah is David the king. And a descendant of David is Mary, the mother of Jesus. So Jesus also is a descendant of David, a very important thing about Jesus, because God makes further promises. He makes the promises to Abraham. He makes promises to Isaac. He makes promises to Jacob. He makes promises to David. And those promises are fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So what about the promises? How are they fulfilled? Did Abraham receive the land of Canaan? Well, he didn't. In Genesis 23, we find that Sarah dies, and Abraham doesn't own any land on which to bury her. He has to go and buy a cave that he can bury Sarah in. That's in Hebron. He hasn't received the promise yet. And there's a comment on that in Hebrews 11, which is a list of men of faith, among them Abraham. And the point is that they haven't received the promise. He hasn't received the promise of the land. He hasn't received it yet. but he will. God has provided something for us as well, so that we can receive promises at the same time that Abraham does. And that means Abraham is going to be raised from the dead. He's going to be allowed to live off the land of which he is the owner, to live with his family, all these descendants, the faithful ones will be there as well. And if we are faithful people, we also can be part of the family of Abraham and receive a portion of his promise. The other thing about it is that Abraham is the first person of whom it is stated that he received forgiveness of sins because he acted in faith. He acted in faith. He did what God asked him to do, and he was treated as a righteous man because of it. And when it comes to the day of judgment, it's because Abraham acted in faith that he is going to be raised from the dead and given eternal life. So faith becomes important, and Abraham is a kind of prototype of the faithful. He acted in faith, he believed God, he acted on the result of that belief, and as a result he is treated as a righteous man, and he is given promises by God. And that's available to other people through faith. And the important thing about him is faith. That's what it says about him in Romans. And in Galatians, we're told that we too can be blessed with Abraham if we are people of faith as well. So let's summarize what we've seen. First of all, we've got Abraham, the prototype of the faithful, the first man of whom it said that he was justified by faith. Justified by faith is exactly what he was. Something else to remember, that faith and acting on that faith has got to be enough to make us change our lives, is what makes us right with God. And finally, these promises that Abraham received, a promise of eternal life, the promise of resurrection from the dead, are something that we can become part of if we also have faith.